22,000 men dead, wounded, or missing in about 12 hours. On a strip of Maryland farmland so ordinary it barely deserved a name until it became one. That's what Antietam did on September 17, 1862. It compressed an entire nation's war into a single, choking day, and made the United States pay more blood in one sunrise to sunset stretch than it has ever paid again. The worst part is that the slaughter wasn't inevitable. Antietam wasn't a surprise ambush or a doomed last stand. It was a battle the Union could have turned into a decisive destruction of Robert E. Lee's army if timing, nerve, and leadership aligned for just a few key hours. Instead, Antietam became a day of brutal partial victories, missed openings, and men dying in sections. Like the battlefield was a machine with multiple mouths. To understand why the day turned that way, you have to start with why Lee was in Maryland at all. In September 1862, the Confederacy needed more than survival. It needed momentum. Virginia had been fought over repeatedly, farms stripped, roads clogged, and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was hungry, exhausted, and dangerous. By moving north into Maryland, Lee aimed to relieve pressure on Virginia, gather supplies, and strike a psychological blow. A Confederate victory on Northern soil might shake Northern public confidence, influence elections, and most importantly in Lee's mind, encourage Britain or France to treat the Confederacy as something more than a rebellion on borrowed time. It was the kind of gamble that can save a cause or ruin it, and Lee knew it. Facing him was George B. McClellan, commander of the Union's Army of the Potomac. McClellan was brilliant at building an army and inspiring loyalty, but he carried a fatal habit. He believed every Confederate force was larger than it really was. He saw extra divisions in every wood line, extra artillery behind every ridge phantoms that made him cautious when he needed to be ruthless. And then, in one of the war's most infamous twists, McClellan got handed a gift that should have erased caution: a lost copy of Lee's orders, revealing that Lee had separated parts of his army. It meant Lee was briefly vulnerable, his pieces far apart, and a rapid Union strike could have crushed those pieces before they reunited. McClellan moved, but not with the speed that turns intelligence into victory. By the time the two armies converged near Sharpsburg, Maryland, Lee had gathered enough strength to form a defensive line west of Antietam Creek, using terrain like an engineer uses angles. His left anchored near woods and a small white Dunker church, a simple building belonging to a peaceful religious community that would soon be surrounded by the loudest violence imaginable. His center ran through rolling ground with a sunken farm road that could function like a trench. His right reached toward a stone bridge and higher ground near the town. The field looked pastoral. The reality was geometry: ridges for artillery, fences that could become cover, and patches of woods that swallowed formations until the moment they were close enough to kill each other at near point-blank range. McClellan's plan was to attack Lee on multiple points. In theory, that would pin Lee and prevent him from shifting troops. In practice, McClellan attacked in segments, a pattern that let Lee move defenders to whichever sector was under the heaviest threat. This is the secret mechanism behind Antietam's casualty. Concentrated killing in short bursts against fixed positions, repeated across the day because neither side was knocked out, and because leadership on the Union side never threw the entire weight of the army into one decisive hammer blow. The night before the battle carried a strange calm. Accounts described damp air, smoke from cooking fires, men writing quick letters with stiff fingers, and that particular silence that exists only when thousands of people know tomorrow will be different, and they don't know whether they'll still exist to describe it. At first light, the battle began in the north. Union troops under Joseph Hooker advanced toward what would become a cursed patch of ground, the cornfield. It was just harvest corn, tall enough to hide men, dense enough to break lines of sight, and placed exactly where two armies would collide. Across from Hooker's men were Stonewall Jackson's veterans, positioned to resist, experienced in absorbing shock. When the first volleys cracked, the cornfield didn't witness war. It became war. Musket fire at close range in dense formations turns each volley into a scythe. The corn stalks were cut down as if the field itself were being executed. Men dropped in rows. Flags lurched forward, then faltered as the men beneath them fell. Units surged in, fired, and were shredded, then replaced by another unit ordered forward because commanders on both sides believed the next push would finally break the other. The fighting spread toward the Dunker Church in the West Woods, where smoke and trees created a deadly concealment that made every movement feel like stepping into a trap. The commanding officers were hit. Hooker was wounded, and confusion about who had authority rippled across the lines even as the firing never truly paused. In that northern sector, Antietam established its signature, a small area producing an out-of-proportion harvest of casualties because the fighting kept returning to the same patches of ground. The cornfield changed hands repeatedly, and every exchange was paid for in bodies that would not get up again. Yet for all that blood, the line didn't collapse. It bent, it bled, it shifted, but it held because Lee could reinforce just enough, and because McClellan was expensive with his reserves. While the North became a rotating furnace of brigades, the center of the battlefield began to simmer toward its own nightmare, and the day still had hours of killing left to deliver. The question at this point wasn't whether the Union could hurt Lee. It already had. The question was whether the Union would commit the full force needed to end Lee's army in one day, or whether Antietam would become an enormous sacrifice that bought only ambiguity. And as the smoke thickened and the fighting moved toward the Confederate center, that uncertainty tightened like a noose around the entire battle. As the morning wore on, the cornfield continued to function like a revolving door into death. But the battle's center was preparing its own signature horror, one that would later be described with a name so blunt it barely feels like language: Bloody Lane. The Confederate center included a sunken farm road, worn down by wagon wheels and time, into a shallow trench that offered protection and a deceptively strong firing position. From a distance, it did not look like a fortress. Up close, it was a straight line where Confederate rifles could fire from cover into men advancing across open ground. Union commanders, seeing the center as the place where Lee might break, pushed divisions forward. They advanced in waves, often with limited visibility because smoke, rolling terrain, and conflicting reports turned the battlefield into a rumor factory. Men stepped over fences, moved through orchards, and walked into concentrated volleys that hit so hard they seemed to stop time. Lines staggered, reformed, and advanced again because retreat under fire feels like drowning, and because the instinct to move forward sometimes outweighs the instinct to live. The sunken road filled with bodies, not in a theatrical heap, but in the practical, grim way that happens when men are hit in a trench and cannot be easily removed. The Union began to push closer, trading musket fire so near that the meaning of the enemy became the face at the other end of your sight line. The fighting was so intense that officers at times struggled to keep orders coherent. Men fired until barrels heated, then fired again, because a soldier does not have time to consider whether the day will be remembered, only whether the next second will exist. Eventually, a fragile opening appeared. Parts of the Confederate line in the center wavered. A gap formed or threatened to form. Historians debate its size and decisiveness, but everyone agrees it was a moment of real peril for Lee. In a battle of attrition, a gap is not merely a hole. It is an invitation to collapse. If the Union could punch through with fresh troops and expand the breach, Lee's army could be split, rolled back, and possibly destroyed or forced into a retreat that would become a rout. This is where Antietam's legend of the mischance becomes unavoidable. McClellan had the manpower. He maintained large reserves he refused to commit fully, convinced Lee was hiding additional forces and waiting to counterattack. That fear-phantom armies made McClellan treat his own strength as too precious to risk in a decisive strike. He held back units that could have turned a battered Confederate center into a breaking Confederate center, and because he did, the moment passed. The Confederates stabilized, sometimes with small local adjustments, sometimes with exhausted men throwing themselves into the line because there was no other choice. Antietam didn't reward hesitation. It punished it by making the casualty bill larger without making the outcome decisive, while the center bled out into the sunken road. The southern sector of the field developed its own cruel bottleneck, a stone bridge over Antietam Creek. The bridge, later forever linked with the name of Union General Ambrose Burnside, was narrow and exposed to fire from higher ground on the far bank. A relatively small Confederate force defended it, positioned so well that it behaved like a larger one. That is another Antietam mechanism, terrain multiplying defenders. Burnside's troops attempted to cross again and again, and each attempt was choked by the bridge's funnel effect. Men running onto the bridge became targets compressed into a corridor, and the stone parapets chipped under bullets. The creek itself wasn't vast, but had steep banks and awkward crossings, and under fire even a small obstacle becomes a wall. Delay here was disastrous, not because Burnside lacked courage, but because Antietam was a battle where sectors were connected by time. Every hour Burnside failed to cross was an hour Lee could shift troops elsewhere, an hour Lee could survive the pressure in the center and north. The bridge fight became its own tragedy, men dying for yards of stone while miles of war raged elsewhere. Finally, after hours of attempts, Burnside's men took the bridge and began pushing up the far bank. On the map, it looked like the moment the Union left could finally turn Lee's right and threaten his retreat. In the human experience of the day, it felt like arriving late to a catastrophe you were supposed to prevent. By early afternoon, the battlefield had produced what might have been the ingredients of a decisive Union victory. Lee's left battered in the cornfield and woods. Lee's center damaged around the sunken road. And now Lee's right pressured by forces that had crossed the creek. Yet the ingredients did not automatically become the outcome. Antietam required one more thing: coordination and a willingness to commit. McClellan's command style made coordination fragile. His corps attacked sequentially, not as a unified tidal wave. He watched the battle from a distance, receiving reports that were often delayed or contradictory, and his skepticism about those reports made him slow to exploit brief openings. Lee, in contrast, was closer to his crisis points and operated like a man who understood that survival in this moment mattered more than elegance. He shifted what he could, asked the impossible of exhausted soldiers, and relied on the fact that the Union's blows were not landing all at once. By mid-afternoon, Burnside's push threatened to become the day's decisive movement, the one that could cut Lee off and force collapse. If Burnside could drive toward Sharpsburg and seize key ground, Lee's entire position would become a trap. But Antietam had one last brutal trick: the sudden arrival of fresh men at the worst possible time. As Burnside advanced, the sound that mattered was not the sound of gunfire behind him, it was the new sound approaching. The rhythm of boots in the shape of a division arriving hard from distance, turning a Union opportunity into a new Confederate counterstroke. Late afternoon is where Antietam's outcome crystallized into its most haunting form, a day of enormous violence that still refused to deliver closure. Burnside's troops, after finally taking the bridge, pushed toward Sharpsburg across open rolling ground, with the sense that the Confederate right could be cracked if they kept momentum. But momentum in war is not a mood. It is organization under fire. Burnside's men had spent hours paying for a crossing, and now they had to reorganize align units and advance while exhausted, while confused, and while the enemy gathered itself. The Confederates in that sector were thin, and on paper Burnside's push looked promising, but the battlefield rarely rewards paper. Lee, watching this threat develop, was in danger of having his line of retreat compromised. If Burnside seized the wrong ridge at the wrong time, Lee could be trapped. Yet Lee had been surviving on crises all day. He knew the battle was a series of emergencies, and he treated Burnside's push as the next emergency rather than as the final catastrophe. Then, as if the battlefield itself had decided to change the script, a P. Hill's Light Division arrived from Harper's Ferry after a forced march. Their arrival is one of the most decisive timing moments in Civil War history. Fresh Confederate troops hitting a Union advance that was extended and vulnerable. Hill's men slammed into Burnside's flank, and the Union's apparent axis of victory suddenly became a new fight for survival. The Union lines tried to pivot, but pivoting under fire is like trying to turn a ship in a storm with half the crew missing. Confusion spread fast. Units that had been advancing now had to defend. Officers who were trying to maintain forward movement now had to prevent collapse. The result was not a Union rout, but a halting of the Union's decisive chance. The late-day pressure that could have broken Lee's right instead stabilized into a battered standoff. Meanwhile, the northern and central sectors were already exhausted into a violent equilibrium, and the day began to dim without delivering a decisive destruction of Lee's army. When evening came, the firing slowed and then faded, but the battlefield did not become calm. It became quiet in the worst way, the quiet where you can hear what you were previously too busy to hear. Men calling for water, wounded soldiers moaning, stretchers scraping across dirt, and the distant intermittent crack of finishing shots or scattered skirmishes. This is where Antietam's casualty number stops being a statistic and becomes a landscape. Roughly 22,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing by the end of the day, a combined toll that remains the highest casualty count of any single day in U.S. military history. Missing carried its own terror. Some were captured, some were lost from units, and some were dead in places no one could reach yet. For the wounded, the night did not bring relief. 19th century battlefield medicine moved quickly but was overwhelmed by volume. Surgeons worked in farmhouses, barns, and any structure that could hold lantern light. The air filled with the smell of smoke, sweat, damp earth, and the metallic tong of blood. While men waited, knowing that the order in which you were treated might decide your survival as much as the wound itself. The Dunker Church, a symbol of peace, became a grim sanctuary surrounded by the evidence of how little peace mattered to artillery and rifles. Stretcher-bearers worked until their arms shook. Clergymen and civilians tried to comfort men whose minds were already somewhere else. Across the field, the cornfield and Bloody Lane became places you could recognize not by signposts but by the density of bodies and the tear in the landscape where so much fire had passed through it. And as the armies settled into night positions, the battle's strategic reality emerged in a paradox. McClellan could claim he had stopped Lee's invasion of the North. Lee could claim he had survived a larger enemy and remained effective. By the next day, Lee would withdraw across the Potomac, ending the Confederate Maryland campaign. That withdrawal mattered. It meant the Union held the field, which in conventional military language often implies a victory, but it was not the kind of victory Americans wanted. It did not destroy Lee. It did not end the war. It left the nation with grief and the knowledge that the conflict could reach this intensity in a single day and still continue afterward. Yet Antietam's importance did not stop at the field's edge. It provided Abraham Lincoln with the political opening he had been waiting for. Lincoln had contemplated an emancipation policy that would redefine the war's meaning, but he feared issuing it after a clear Union defeat would look like an act of desperation. Antietam, ambiguous as it was, provided enough of a Union success to act. Within days, Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that enslaved people in territories still in rebellion would be declared free as of January 1, 1863. And setting the stage for black men to be accepted into Union military service. Antietam, therefore, became a hinge. The war's bloodiest day created the conditions for a moral and political transformation that would change foreign opinion, undermine Confederate hopes of recognition, and shift the war's stakes beyond mere reunion. That transformation did not comfort the wounded on the field, but it changed the war's direction. Antietam also did something else that shocked the public. It brought the reality of death into civilian view through battlefield photography. Images of bodies at Antietam, seen by civilians who had previously experienced the war through words and rumors, carried a visceral force that casualty lists could not. It made the war harder to romanticize. It made the cost undeniable. And it increased pressure on leaders to justify sacrifices with results. That pressure would soon turn against McClellan, whose caution now seemed less like prudence and more like failure. The night after Antietam was full of wounded men and exhausted commanders, but the real cliff edge of the story wasn't the suffering. America had already seen suffering. The cliff edge was this. After the bloodiest day, Lee's army was still alive, still coherent enough to retreat, and the opportunity to end the conflict quickly had slipped into darkness. Antietam's legacy is a brutal equation. Maximum cost, incomplete closure, and enormous consequences anyway. In tactical terms, the battle ended Lee's invasion of the North and forced the Confederate Army back across the Potomac. In strategic terms, it did not deliver the decisive destruction McClellan was positioned to achieve. This is why Antietam still feels like a haunted lesson about leadership and timing. McClellan's defenders argue that his army was battered, that the battlefield was chaotic, that Lee's line was stronger than it looked, and that pursuing aggressively after such losses risked disaster. His critics argue that McClellan's caution created self-fulfilling failure, that by holding back large reserves and treating the battle as three separate fights rather than one coordinated hammer blow, he allowed Lee to survive when Lee was at his most vulnerable. Both views contain truth. The Army of the Potomac did suffer immense casualties and exhaustion. The Army of Northern Virginia was also stretched thin and repeatedly on the edge of breaking. The difference between decisive victory and indecisive carnage lived in minutes and in whether fresh troops were used as a finishing force or preserved as insurance against enemies that existed mainly in McClellan's imagination. This is why Antietam is so chilling. It shows that indecision does not mean nothing happened. Indecision means people died in enormous numbers without achieving the full strategic outcome their suffering could have purchased. The battlefield itself became a set of symbols because symbols are how the public processes mass death. The cornfield represented the terrifying efficiency of close-range volleys and repeated assaults. The Dunker Church represented moral irony, peace in the center of hell. Bloody Lane represented how terrain can transform an ordinary road into a trench and a trench into a grave. Burnside Bridge represented how a narrow crossing can demand an impossible blood toll simply because it funnels men into fire. And the overall casualty figure, 22,000 plus, represented how the Civil War was becoming something too vast and too intimate to be treated as a quick political quarrel. Those symbols also fed the war's next phase, Lincoln's Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, made possible by Antietam's outcome, changed the conflict from a war fought mainly to restore the Union into a war explicitly linked to ending slavery in rebellious territory. That shift mattered internationally. Foreign governments could more easily justify staying out of a conflict framed as a fight against slavery than one framed only as a domestic power struggle. It mattered militarily. It opened the way for black soldiers to fight, adding manpower and moral energy to the Union cause. And it mattered psychologically. It told the Confederacy the war was no longer only about political separation, but about the survival of its foundational system. War with higher stakes becomes less negotiable, and less negotiable war becomes longer, more total, and more bitter. Antietam, therefore, did not just end a campaign. It hardened the war's meaning. That is one more cruel paradox. The Bloodiest Day helped create a moral turning point, but moral turning points do not automatically reduce bloodshed. Often they increase it by making compromise harder. In the weeks after Antietam, the human cost radiated outward. Families received letters that were too short, written by men who suspected they wouldn't return. Communities in Maryland dealt with wounded strangers and dead strangers, a reminder that wars are national precisely because suffering becomes shared. Soldiers carried images that never left. Friends cut down in the cornfield, lines collapsing into bloody lane, the feeling of stepping over bodies because there was no path that did not. Many survivors would later describe Antietam with a hollow tone, as if describing something that happened to someone else, because distancing is how the mind survives memory. The political cost also sharpened. Lincoln, watching McClellan's failure to pursue and destroy Lee after Antietam, concluded that McClellan would not fight the kind of war needed to end it. Not long afterward, Lincoln removed him from command. That decision mattered because it signaled a shift in Union leadership toward commanders willing to accept the brutal arithmetic the war demanded. Coordinated pressure, relentless pursuit, and less tolerance for cautious delay. Antietam, in that sense, was a pivot in military culture. It exposed that the Union could win battles and still lose time, and in a long war, losing time is often another way of losing men. Antietam's memory also remains controversial in a quieter way because it is remembered both as a Union victory and as a Union failure. The Union held the field and stopped Lee's invasion victory. The Union did not destroy Lee when it had the chance failure. The truth is that Antietam contains both, which is exactly why it's such a powerful story for a modern audience. It satisfies the need for intensity and numbers, but it also contains a mystery of human decision. How can a commander have superior strength, rare intelligence on enemy movements, and multiple moments of opportunity, and still fail to close the trap? That mystery is not abstract. It is written into the lives lost. And it leads to the final hard point of Antietam. The day proves that war can demand the maximum payment and still refuse to give you the one thing people want most after paying an end. When Lee's army retreated across the Potomac, the creek near Sharpsburg went quiet again, but the nation did not. The war continued, and it would continue until the country was exhausted enough to accept the terms of peace. Antietam stands as the day America learned in the harshest language possible, that it could bleed on an industrial scale in a single day and still wake up the next morning inside the same war. And if you want the most unsettling way to describe it, it's this. Antietam wasn't just the bloodiest 12 hours. It was the day the country realized the war might not be decided by one great battle all meaning the next 12 hours were already waiting somewhere down the road.